So, was the Buddha a philosopher? My friend Justin Whitaker and I wrote a paper about that came out in this journal last year, and we'll talk about that coming up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in helping to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. So my friend Justin Whitaker and I wrote a journal paper about the question whether the Buddha was a philosopher. Justin was a grad student in Buddhist studies, has a background in philosophy as well. I have a background in philosophy. We're both interested in this question. And it was published in Philosophy East and West, which is a very prestigious journal in comparative philosophy, last year. This may seem a weird question to ask, in particular because of the way people think about philosophy nowadays. But I think we should go into a little bit of that first. So what is philosophy? There's a contemporary definition of it, I think, and what we might call a classical definition. A contemporary definition, which is how we are familiar with the term now, tends to revolve around people in academia, academics, writing papers like this one, getting them published in scholarly journals, going to conferences, giving classes, working at universities. Basically people who are doing theoretical work, entirely theoretical work, and spending their time in discussions and arguments and conferences with other academics doing entirely theoretical work. And it's very difficult to define that work, but basically they're looking at concepts. What are the concepts we use? What do they really mean? How do we really use them? How do we use them in the best way? And they're also interested in the deep questions, such as metaphysics, how does the world work? How do our concepts of various physical processes really work with each other? Interested in questions of justice, interested in questions of ethics, things like that. How we know what we know. So a broad sort of umbrella of questions that are asked in contemporary philosophy. Now in ancient philosophy, what we might call classical philosophy, which let's be clear, philosophy is a Western concept. It comes out of ancient Greece. The general idea there was less about a kind of an academic enterprise and more about a philosophy of life. That is, philosophy was supposed to interact with our day-to-day life. And the question philosophers in ancient Greece and ancient Rome were really after, the real question they were after was the broad one of ethics. But for ethics, for them, did not mean a kind of an enterprise of figuring out which actions were right and wrong, but rather it meant, how do we live the good life? What is the good life? How do we live a life that is the best kind of life that we can live? And that approach to philosophy, the approach to philosophy as a kind of a lived enterprise rather than a profession of academics, is something that we have lost nowadays. Although certain contemporary philosophers, like Massimo Pigliucci, who I've discussed on this channel before, are interested in bringing that back. And Massimo works in particular with ancient Stoicism as a sort of a source for his ideas. And in fact, Stoicism is one of the ancient philosophies that people like, there was a 20th century philosopher and thinker named Pierre Hadot, who wrote about this difference, and how ancient philosophies like Stoicism or like Aristotle and Socrates were more interested in philosophy as kind of a way of structuring your life rather than as an academic kind of enterprise. Now, one of the things that got Justin and me interested in this topic is that there are certain people who do Buddhist studies, very, very eminent Buddhist studies scholars, who want to say that the Buddha himself was not a philosopher. That is, that there were later people within the Buddhist tradition, particularly, let's say, the Abhidhamma people who wrote the Abhidhamma, who were mostly unknown, and also known people, thinkers like Nagarjuna, who they say are clearly philosophers because of their kind of rigorous interest in argumentation, in highly formalized structures of thought and of metaphysics or ontology or epistemology, whereas they say the Buddha himself was less interested in those kinds of things. And in that sense, certain let's say, certain scholars of Buddhism want to say that yes, Buddhism as a whole constitutes a kind of philosophy, or many different kinds actually, but the Buddha himself was not particularly philosophical, or was not a philosopher. On the other hand, there are certain scholars, such as Damien Kuhn, who want to say that the Buddha himself was what we would call today a virtue ethicist. That is to say, that the ethical picture that he gave which was, like those in ancient Greece, about the good life, how you live the good life. And his answer to that was much like those you might find in ancient Greece, in particular Aristotle and the Stoics. He was interested in promoting ways of increasing certain human virtues. And precisely what those virtues are is something of a question because, of course, the Buddha himself didn't quite think of it in the same terms as people in ancient Greece did, but we might say the virtues of non-hatred, non-delusion, and non-greed, which would be, if you like, non-hatred would be virtues of loving kindness, virtues of compassion, of sympathetic joy. Non-ignorance would be wisdom, the virtue of wisdom. And non-greed would be the virtues of generosity and renunciation. But there are other, of course, Western traditions of ethics involving, let's say, consequential ethics, which looks at the character of our actions and asks, do our actions bring good consequences? If they do, then they're ethically just or justifiable. If they bring bad consequences, then they're not. And again, there are certain aspects of early Buddhism, of the Buddha's own teachings, where he does talk about consequences of actions and does say exactly that kind of thing. If an action brings benefit, then one should pursue it. And if an action doesn't, then one shouldn't. So in all these senses, the Buddha really was a philosopher in the same way that, let's say, Socrates was a philosopher. That is, he wasn't really so interested in coming up with a detailed structure of ontology or detailed, as we might say, scholarly kind of treatment of epistemology, of how we know what we know. That wasn't what he was after. What he was after was more dialogic. He was after teaching people in their daily life rather than coming up with the equivalent of academic arguments for particular ends. And in particular, we can say that his ethical path was, in fact, slightly different from those you'd find in the West. Again, we can look at it as a virtue ethics, as increasing our human virtues. We can look at it as a consequential kind of ethics, of looking towards consequences, good consequences of actions and avoiding the bad ones. But of course, the Buddha himself expressed it in terms of the Four Noble Truths, or another way of understanding those is as the four tasks or four practices that we undertake. We undertake to understand how our normal life is unsatisfactory in many ways. In particular, it's unsatisfactory because of the way we tend to crave and cling to things that are not permanent. And we undertake to abandon that kind of craving and clinging in order to achieve a state of awakening, which consists in a disintegration of our normal tendencies towards greed, hatred, and ignorance. And finally, in order to do that, we're supposed to pursue the Eightfold Path, which is the heart of Buddhist practice. And that is, I think, a structure of Buddhist ethics that the Buddha himself would have endorsed, because it captures the essence of how he taught. Now, of course, it's also definitely true that philosophy is intimately interested in reason and argument, in reasoned arguments to particular ends. That is, the difference between, or one main difference between philosophy and religion is that in religion, at least as understood in the West most of the time, religion, the tenets of religion, what we're supposed to believe in religion, is usually approached or reached by revelation. That is, that God or gods come down to us in some respect. They give certain special people special knowledge, which is itself not open to doubt, and then those special people reveal it to the rest of us through scripture, through teaching, and so on. And that's different from philosophy, where, in particular, we're not supposed to accept knowledge in that respect, where we understand that supposed revealed knowledge at the moment is just surmise, that what we need is evidence, we need, in particular, reason to accept those kinds of arguments. And so the question, I think, for many scholars of early Buddhism is to what extent the Buddha was open to reason and argument. But I think it's eminently clear from, if we read the Pali Canon, and I won't go through the many kinds of evidence one finds there, but the Buddha was intimately interested in reason and argument. In particular, he argued constantly with his cultural competitors at the time, people of other competing philosophies. what we might call even proto-religions now. He had very detailed arguments against them. He would attempt to catch them in contradictions. He would point out the contradictions to them in order to get them to cease to believe what the Buddha approached as incorrect views. And the Buddha, of course, recommended that his followers do the same, that they approach the Dhamma, his teaching, with a critical eye. That is, that they question the Dhamma, that they approach it for themselves, they try to see it in their own lives, that they don't accept anything merely on his say-so, but because they have good reason to accept it. And indeed, when we look at awakening itself, we look at the factors of awakening, which are a group of factors that arise in us as we pursue that path. One of the key factors of awakening is investigation of Dhammas. That is to say, that once we are in a state of mindfulness, one of the things we're supposed to do is to investigate those states that surround us as we become aware of them. And that's an investigation which is both empirical, but also a reasoned investigation. Now, that said, if one compares the Buddha's teaching with, let's say, the teaching we find in ancient Greece, it's true that in ancient Greece, reason and argument were held in a higher regard to an extent than the Buddha himself. That is, the Buddha had, we might say, arguments, reasons against taking reason and argument too far. Now, that's not because reason and argument were wrong in themselves, but rather that, number one, if they were not founded on good empirical evidence, they could lead us astray. And this is something we know all too well ourselves. The whole idea of the sort of armchair scientist who likes to sit in his armchair and talk about, how physics should be done or how chemistry should be done. We know from the history of the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries up to the present day, that doesn't work. That we can't actually found a lot of aspects of philosophical reasoning just on reasoning alone. It has to include evidence from the senses, evidence from the world. So, and the Buddha agreed with that. The Buddha would have said that that was a problem with reason and argument alone. So they were not to be accepted on their own, but only when combined with good evidence from the world. And secondly, when it came in particular to his own disciples, to his own students, his own monastic followers, he was somewhat skeptical of argument in the sense that he understood that reasoned argument often led towards a dispute and enmity and anger between people and hatred. He discusses this in an early sutta in the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata, which I've discussed before, a particular sutta which is called Arguments and Disputes. And in that sutta, he discusses exactly this, that there is an aspect of argument and dispute which really leads to no good end. That is, if the end that we're really trying to pursue, that is the good life, is one of avoiding anger and hatred, then we have to ask, well, if our arguments and disputes are in fact making anger and hatred worse, maybe we should give those up. Or at least strive to pursue them with an attitude of non-clinging to views, which is very, very difficult. And this is something I've discussed in prior videos. This attitude that the Buddha recommended was one of non-clinging to views, where one could discuss them dispassionately as, let's say, features of the world, but nevertheless without identifying with them as mine, without clinging to them, and without therefore getting upset when other people contradict us. So in sum, both Justin and I do believe that the Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, insofar as we know about him, seems to have been a philosopher very much in the same mold as the philosophers of ancient Greece, such as Socrates, such as Aristotle, and such as the ancient Stoics. And we might say that it doesn't really matter whether we consider the Buddha a philosopher, but the reason why both of us, both Justin and I, do think it matters is because the material deserves to be studied within a philosophical context. Students in Western universities, I think, who are interested in philosophy should at least potentially be exposed to some of this early teaching because it fits within the same context. And when I say that we should try to pursue a life that is wiser, that is kinder, and that is less stressed, basically what I'm saying is that is a kind of good life that we ought to strive for ourselves and for those around us in the world. And we should do what we can to promote this kind of lifestyle and to promote this kind of attitude towards life. And this is at base, this is a philosophical kind of conclusion, but it's not an academic philosophical conclusion. It's a philosophical conclusion the way the ancient Greeks would have understood the term, as something that we're supposed to live with, not simply argue in abstract as though we're not going to put it into practice. It's something to put into practice. So what do you guys think? I'd really be interested to know. Put your comments and questions in the section down below. Thanks so much for watching the video, and we'll catch you on the next video. Bye-bye.